I hadn't expected anyone to be home that evening. The house was still and dimly illuminated by the soft glow of a few scattered lamps, while the gentle patter of rain tapped against the windows. I poured myself a glass of deep red wine and retreated to the solitude of my room, indulging in a rare moment of peace. Loneliness has a way of creeping in when you least anticipate it, doesn't it? My husband, Thomas, was away on yet another business trip, something I had grown accustomed to over the years, but this time, the loneliness felt different. I was restless, unsettled in a way I couldn't quite describe. It was a yearning, an ache that no amount of discipline could quell, so I made a choice. A private one. Something to fill the emptiness, if only temporarily. I had just begun when a faint noise reached my ears. At first I dismissed it as the wind rattling the old window frame or the house settling in its usual way. But then it came again. Footsteps. My heart raced, but I told myself it was nothing. My stepson, Lucas, had mentioned going out with friends, so there was no reason to think he would be back so soon. Even so, I froze when I heard his voice, soft but nearby. "Ava, are you okay in there?" Panic surged through me. The room was dim except for the flicker of the TV screen. I fumbled with the remote, trying to turn it off, but my trembling hands betrayed me, amplifying my urgency. The sound, the unmistakable, incriminating sound, seemed deafening. "Ava!" he called again, his voice closer now. Before I could gather my thoughts or form an excuse to send him away, the door creaked open. I hadn't locked it, and there he was, standing in the doorway, his eyes wide with surprise. For a moment, neither of us moved, frozen in a shared web of shock and humiliation. I wasn't sure what I expected him to do. Turn away, laugh, maybe say something sarcastic. But his expression was something else entirely. Curiosity. "I thought something was wrong," he stammered, his gaze darting between me and the screen before quickly looking away. "It's not what it looks like," I blurted, though the words sounded hollow, even to me. Except, of course, it was exactly what it seemed. My face burned as I scrambled to explain, but no words came. The air was thick with tension, a fragile thread ready to snap. Finally, he cleared his throat and muttered, I'll let you be. I should go." But he didn't leave immediately. Instead, he lingered for a brief moment, as though something held him there, unable to tear his eyes away. In that instant, something changed. It wasn't just the awkwardness or the humiliation. It was the silent understanding that this moment would stay with both of us, impossible to forget. When the door finally closed, leaving me alone again, I sat motionless, still gripping the wine glass. My heart pounded, not from fear, but from something deeper, something I refused to name. That night, I told myself it was just a lapse in judgment, an accident. But deep down, I knew better. Some boundaries once crossed can never be redrawn, and this was only the beginning. When Lucas moved back home, I expected to see the same reserved, distant young man I had first met when Thomas and I got married. But at 25, he was no longer a boy. He carried himself with a quiet confidence, an effortless charm I hadn't noticed before. He had grown into himself. And while I knew it was wrong to acknowledge such things, I couldn't help but feel a flicker of awareness whenever he was near. That awareness lingered after our encounter. It wasn't just the embarrassment of being caught in a vulnerable moment. It was the look in his eyes, the curiosity, the hesitation, as though he was just as intrigued by what he'd seen as he was embarrassed. For the next few days, I avoided him. If I heard his footsteps, I retreated to the kitchen or busied myself in the garden. But Lucas seemed intent on closing the gap between us. One evening, as I washed dishes, he knocked on the kitchen door. "Hey," he said casually, leaning against the frame. "I didn't mean to scare you the other night." I focused on the soap suds, letting the warm water distract me. "It's fine," I replied quickly. "I should have locked the door." "You don't have to explain," he said, his tone earnest. "Everyone deserves their privacy." There was a pause, and then he added, "But you seemed upset. Are you okay?" His question caught me off guard. It had been years since anyone had asked how I was, really asked with genuine concern. Thomas was always so consumed with work, and I had long since learned to bury my emotions beneath the surface of the perfect wife. "I'm fine," I said too quickly, then softened. "Thank you for asking." He nodded but didn't leave. His presence filled the small kitchen, and the air between us felt charged with an unspoken tension. It lingered, subtle but insistent, wrapping around us in ways I couldn't ignore. Over the weeks that followed, Lucas and I settled into an unusual rhythm. He was attentive in ways Thomas never was. He'd offer to help with little things, bringing in groceries, fixing a leaky faucet, or simply sitting with me on the porch at sunset. One evening, as we shared a bottle of wine on the back deck, he surprised me with a question. "Do you ever feel lonely, Ava?" I paused, the glass halfway to my lips. "What do you mean?" "I mean, Thomas is gone a lot, and it seems like you don't have many people to talk to." His words struck a chord I didn't know existed within me. "That's not true," I replied, my tone more defensive than I intended. He shrugged, his gaze steady. "I'm just saying, I'm here if you ever need someone to talk to, or not talk to. Whatever you need." There was something disarming about his honesty. It wasn't pity. It felt like genuine understanding. It happened again late one night. I had gone downstairs to grab a glass of water and found Lucas sitting in the living room, bathed in the soft glow of the television. When he saw me, his expression softened. "Can't sleep?" he asked. I shook my head. "Not really." "Want to join me?" he offered. I hesitated for a moment before sinking into the chair across from him. The silence between us was easy at first, but then he turned off the TV, leaning forward with his elbows resting on his knees. "About the other night," he began, his voice quiet. I immediately tensed. "Lucas, we don't need to discuss that." "Maybe not," he admitted, "but I can't stop thinking about it." My breath caught. Lucas stood and moved across the room, sitting on the edge of the coffee table just inches away from me. "I'm not trying to make you uncomfortable," he said, his voice barely audible. "But I think you feel it too." His words hung in the air between us, heavy and undeniable. I wanted to protest, to insist he was wrong, but I couldn't. The truth was too obvious to ignore. That night, the line between us blurred for the first time. It wasn't planned, it wasn't rational, but it felt inevitable. The days that followed became a haze of stolen moments and whispered promises. We told ourselves it was just a fleeting affair, something temporary to fill the emptiness in our lives. But the more time we spent together, the harder it became to pretend it wasn't something more profound. Lucas was intoxicating in a way I hadn't felt in years. He made me feel seen, alive, and wanted. Yet with every secret touch and lingering glance, the stakes grew higher. Thomas was set to return in a few weeks, and although we were cautious, the strain of keeping our secret began to take its toll. One afternoon, as we returned from a secluded trip to the park, we were blindsided by an unexpected visitor. Naomi, Lucas's ex-girlfriend. She stood on the front porch, arms crossed, a sly smile playing on her lips. "Lucas?" she drawled. "Long time no see." Her gaze flicked to me, lingering a fraction too long, sending a chill down my spine. "Naomi," Lucas said, his tone carefully neutral. "What are you doing here?" "Oh, I just thought I'd stop by," she replied sweetly, though her expression hinted at something more calculated. "I've been thinking about you lately." Her eyes darted between Lucas and me, and in that moment I knew. She knew. This was the start of our unraveling. Naomi's presence posed a threat we hadn't anticipated. Her knack for digging into matters that didn't concern her was sharper than either of us realized. It didn't take long for her to start asking questions we couldn't answer. As the tension rose, so did the pressure. I tried to maintain the appearance of normalcy, but the cracks in our facade were becoming more visible. Naomi's sudden reappearance threw everything off balance. She insisted her visit was spontaneous, but her every word felt calculated. Every glance she directed at Lucas lingered just a little too long, and her smile carried an edge that felt more like a warning. Despite this, Lucas and I tried to carry on as if her presence didn't affect us. We told ourselves she was nothing more than a relic of his past, irrelevant to the connection we were building. Yet her arrival gnawed at me. A week later, Thomas called to inform me his trip had been extended. His voice was distant, his focus clearly on work rather than the wife waiting at home. "I'll be back in 2 weeks, maybe 3, he added casually, almost as an afterthought. I told him to take care of himself, my tone steady, though inside I felt a mixture of guilt and relief. That night, a storm rolled in, rain pounding against the roof and windows. Thunder rumbled in the distance and the power flickered before going out entirely, plunging the house into darkness. I lit a few candles and tried to settle down with a book, but my nerves were frayed. From downstairs, I heard Lucas's voice. Ava? You all right up there? I'm fine, I called back, just trying not to trip over anything. Moments later, a beam of light from his flashlight illuminated the staircase as he climbed up to join me. The power company says it'll be a few hours, he explained. Mind if I hang out here? I hesitated before answering. Sure, as long as you don't mind the candles. He grinned. Better than sitting alone in the dark. We ended up sitting on the living room floor, wrapped in a shared blanket while the storm raged outside. Lucas had brought a bottle of whiskey from the kitchen, and we passed it back and forth, letting its warmth ward off the chill. Do you ever think about what you'd be doing if you weren't here? He asked suddenly. I frowned. What do you mean? If you hadn't married Thomas? If you weren't stuck in this house all the time? His question startled me. I'm not stuck, I replied, though my words sounded hollow, even to me. Lucas raised an eyebrow. Aren't you? Thomas is never here and you don't seem happy. I think you deserve more than this, he said softly. His words twisted something inside me. I wanted to tell him he was wrong, that I was perfectly content. But when I opened my mouth, the truth spilled out instead. I don't know what I'd be doing, I admitted. Sometimes I wonder what life would have been like if I'd made different choices, but it doesn't matter now, does it? This is my life. Lucas leaned closer, his expression intense but gentle. It doesn't have to be. The air between us grew heavy, thick with the tension that had been building for weeks. I should have stopped it. I should have walked away, but instead, when his hand brushed mine, I didn't pull back. In the days that followed, our stolen moments became bolder. Lucas and I found excuses to leave the house together. Trips to the farmer's market, hikes along secluded trails. It wasn't just about the thrill. It was the way he looked at me like I was the center of his world. It was the way he listened when I spoke. The way he made me feel alive in a way I hadn't felt in years. One afternoon, we ended up at a quiet cafe on the outskirts of town. The place was nearly empty, and we chose a booth tucked away in the corner. Our knees brushed beneath the table, and I stared into my coffee, stirring it absent-mindedly. I feel like I'm living someone else's life, I murmured. Lucas tilted his head, studying me closely. Why do you say that? He asked. Because this isn't who I am, I replied softly. I'm not the kind of person who does this. He reached across the table, his hand gently covering mine. Maybe this is who you are, he said quietly. Maybe you just didn't realize it until now. I wanted to believe him. But Naomi wasn't finished with us. Lucas had tried to assure her there was nothing going on, that we were just family. She didn't buy it. One evening, as I returned home from the grocery store, I noticed her car parked outside the house. I stepped inside to find her in the living room with Lucas, her voice raised in anger. You're lying to me, she accused, her tone sharp. I can see it all over your face. Naomi, you're being ridiculous, Lucas replied, his voice calm but firm. Her eyes snapped to me as I entered the room. You're part of this, aren't you? What's going on between the two of you? I forced myself to remain composed. Naomi, this is inappropriate, I said, my tone even. Oh, I think it's very appropriate, she shot back, her voice dripping with venom. Do you think I don't know? I've seen the way you look at each other. Do you really think you can keep this hidden? My heart pounded, but I refused to let her see me falter. You're mistaken, I said steadily, and I think it's time for you to leave. Her smile was cold, almost cruel. Oh, I'll leave, she said, but this isn't over. After she stormed out, Lucas and I sat in silence, the tension in the room unbearable. She knows, I whispered, my voice barely audible. She doesn't have proof, Lucas replied, though he sounded uncertain. It doesn't matter, I said. She's not going to let this go. Lucas reached for my hand. We'll figure it out together, he promised. His words were meant to be reassuring, but the weight of guilt pressed harder on me with each passing day. Every video call with Thomas, every thought about the life I was jeopardizing, made it harder to rationalize what we were doing. And yet, I couldn't stop. Naomi's threat loomed over us like a storm cloud. She lacked concrete evidence, but her boldness and sharp instincts made her dangerous. Lucas, ever hopeful, thought ignoring her would make her go away. It's just talk, he said one evening, his arm draped over the back of the couch as we sat together. It's not just talk, I snapped, pulling away. You didn't see her face when she left. She knows, Lucas. She's looking for a way to destroy us. What do you want me to do? Pay her off? He asked, his frustration flaring but quickly subsiding. I'll handle it, Ava, I promise. But I wasn't convinced. Naomi wasn't someone who could be easily handled. Before Lucas could act on his promise, Thomas came home unexpectedly, 3 days earlier than planned. I was in the kitchen when I heard the front door creak open, followed by his familiar heavy footsteps. My stomach dropped. Lucas was upstairs, and while there was nothing incriminating in the house, their sudden proximity made my pulse race. "Ava!" Thomas called out, his voice rough with exhaustion. I forced my tone to sound cheerful as I wiped my hands on a dish towel. Turning to greet him, I saw the weariness etched on his face, the lines around his mouth deeper than usual. "You didn't tell me you were coming home early," I said. "Finished the meeting sooner than expected," he replied, his eyes scanning the room. "Is Lucas around?" The question caught me off guard. Thomas had never shown much interest in Lucas's whereabouts before. "He's upstairs, I think," I answered carefully. Thomas grunted, pouring himself a glass of water. "I saw Naomi's car parked outside the other day when I called. What was that about?" My heart skipped a beat, but I kept my expression neutral. "I didn't see her. Maybe she stopped by to talk to Lucas," I said calmly. Thomas nodded, not pressing further, but the mention of Naomi left an unsettling feeling in my chest. It didn't take long for Naomi to reappear. One evening, while Thomas was out running errands, I found her waiting on the front porch when I returned from a walk. Her arms were crossed, her eyes glinting with malice. "We need to talk," she said, her tone steady and composed, as though she knew she held all the cards. I considered ignoring her, but the determination in her stance made it clear she wouldn't leave without a confrontation. "What do you want, Naomi?" I asked, keeping my voice as calm as possible. Her smirk widened. "Straight to the point, I like that," she said. After a pause, she added, "I want Lucas." Her words were sharp and unapologetic, and I could already sense where this was heading. "Whatever this is between you two," she continued, "it's not going to last. So why don't you step aside and let him come back to me?" I laughed bitterly. "Lucas is a grown man. He can make his own choices." "Of course he can," she replied, her smile turning icy. "But how do you think Thomas would feel if he knew about your little arrangement? Or the rest of the world, for that matter?" My throat tightened. "You wouldn't." She leaned closer, her voice dropping to a whisper. "All it takes is one text. A picture here, a message there, and your perfect little life crumbles." That night, I told Lucas everything. "We have to stop her," I said. "If she tells Thomas, it's over for both of us." Lucas nodded, his jaw tight. "I'll talk to her. I'll make her understand." But when he returned from meeting her the next day, his face was pale, his hands clenched into fists. "She's not backing down," he said. "She wants money. A lot of it." My stomach churned. "How much?" "50,000, he replied. "She says it's for her silence." "We can't give her that," I said, pacing the room. "She'll just come back for more." Lucas stood abruptly, his frustration boiling over. "Then what do you suggest, Ava? Because I'm out of ideas." Desperate, I turned to my closest friend, Claire. She had always been sharp and resourceful, and while I hated dragging her into this, I had no other options. When I told her the truth, her eyes widened in shock. "Ava," she began, her tone deliberate, "do you even realize how much trouble you're in?" Tears welled up in my eyes as I stammered. "I didn't mean for this to happen. It happened." Claire sighed deeply, rubbing her temples. "All right, let's think this through. Naomi's a problem, but she's not untouchable. There has to be something we can use against her." It turned out Claire was right. Digging into Naomi's past, she unearthed a trail of unpaid debts and a recent run-in with the law. Armed with this information, we crafted a plan to corner her. The confrontation took place in a neutral setting, a small coffee shop on the outskirts of town. Claire and I sat at a corner table, the tension between us palpable as we waited. When Naomi arrived, her confidence was palpable, her expression smug. "I'm flattered," she said, sliding into the seat across from us. "Didn't think you'd have the nerve to face me." "We're done with your games," Claire said firmly, sliding a folder across the table. Naomi opened it, and for a moment, her composure faltered as she examined the contents. "Where did you get this?" she demanded, her voice sharp. "That's not important," Claire replied coolly. "What matters is that we know who you really are. And if you push us any further, we won't hesitate to make this public." Naomi's confidence cracked briefly before she recovered. "You think this scares me? I have nothing to lose." "Maybe," I said, "but Lucas does. And so do I. Here's the deal. Walk away and we'll leave you alone. But if you so much as whisper a word to Thomas or anyone else, we'll make sure everyone knows the truth about you." For a moment, I thought she might call our bluff, But then she stood, clutching the folder tightly. "You'll regret this," she spat before storming out. Naomi's exit should have brought relief, but it left behind a sense of devastation. Lucas and I became even more cautious, but the weight of what we'd done was impossible to escape. Thomas began to notice the tension, his gaze lingering on me longer than usual. "Is something wrong?" he asked one evening as we sat in the living room. "No," I replied quickly. "Why do you ask?" He shrugged. "You've been distant lately, and Lucas seems different too. I just hope everything's okay." The guilt was suffocating. For a few days after Naomi left, things felt calmer. Lucas and I kept our distance while Thomas was home, only speaking when absolutely necessary. But the unease lingered, and the cracks in our facade grew wider. One evening, Thomas suggested we go out to dinner at a new restaurant in town, a rare occurrence given his usual work-driven nature. I agreed, though I wasn't sure whether I was more nervous about leaving Lucas alone or about maintaining the illusion of normalcy with Thomas. Over appetizers, he broke the silence. "I feel like we've grown apart," he said cautiously. I froze, the glass of wine pausing midway to my lips. "What makes you say that?" He hesitated, swirling his drink. "I don't know. Maybe it's work stress, but it feels like you're somewhere else lately. Like your heart isn't in this anymore." Guilt surged through me, but I forced a smile. "You've been busy, Thomas. Maybe we just need to spend more time together." He nodded, though his expression didn't soften. The reprieve was brief. 2 days later, a package arrived for Thomas. I found it on the kitchen counter after running errands. My heart sank when I recognized Naomi's handwriting on the envelope. Tearing it open, my hands shook as I pulled out a USB drive and a note. "Thought you'd like to see what your wife and son have been up to." The implications hit me like a truck. Panic surged as I shoved the note and drive into my pocket. If Thomas had found it first, I couldn't let myself think about that. I immediately called Claire. "She's still playing games," I said, pacing the living room. "I thought we scared her off," Claire replied, her voice laced with frustration. "So did I. Do you think Thomas saw it?" "No, I got to it first," I assured her. "But we need to destroy it. Whatever's on that drive can't exist." Later that night, after the house had gone quiet, I locked myself in the study and plugged the USB into Thomas's computer. My hands trembled as I opened the files. Photos, videos, nothing explicit, but enough to suggest the truth and ruin everything if Thomas ever saw them. I deleted the files and smashed the USB under my heel, but the damage was already done. Naomi wasn't going to stop until she destroyed us. The next morning, I confronted Lucas. "She's still coming after us," I said, my voice tight with worry. His jaw clenched. "I'll handle it." "No," I said firmly. "We need to end this for good." Lucas met my gaze, his expression hard. "How?" "I don't know yet," I admitted. "But we can't just sit here waiting for her to strike." Claire came through for us again, digging deeper into Naomi's past. What she found was unexpected. Naomi had been fired from her previous job for embezzlement. With this new leverage, I devised a risky plan. Lucas and I arranged to meet Naomi at a motel on the outskirts of town, far from prying eyes. She arrived late, her expression smug as she sauntered into the room. "Miss me?" she teased, tossing her purse onto the bed. "We're done with your games," I said, standing my ground. Her smirk wavered. "Oh, are we? That's adorable." Lucas stepped forward, his tone calm but firm. "We know about the money you stole from your last job. We know everything." Naomi's confidence faltered briefly before she sneered. "So what? You think anyone's going to believe you? You're the ones with everything to lose, not me." I pulled out a folder containing the evidence Claire had collected. Bank records, emails, and a signed complaint from her former employer. Naomi's eyes narrowed as she snatched it from my hands. "This is blackmail," she hissed. "It's leverage," I corrected. "Leave us alone and this stays between us. But if you pull anything else, this goes straight to the police." For the first time, Naomi looked genuinely shaken. She threw the folder onto the bed and stormed out without another word. But the relief didn't last. A week later, Thomas confronted me in the kitchen. "Something's not right," he said, his voice cold and accusing. "What are you talking about?" I asked, feigning innocence. "You and Lucas," he said bluntly. "I've seen the way he looks at you, and the way you look at him." My blood turned to ice. "Thomas, that's ridiculous!" "Is it?" he shot back. "Because I don't think it is. I think there's something going on, and I want the truth." The walls felt like they were closing in. "There's nothing to tell," I said quietly, trying to keep my voice steady. Thomas's gaze bore into mine, unrelenting. "Don't insult my intelligence, Ava. I know what I see. The tension was unbearable as I struggled to maintain my composure. If something's bothering you, I said carefully, let's talk about it. Throwing baseless accusations around? Baseless? His voice rose sharply, cutting me off. Then why is Naomi saying otherwise? My stomach dropped. Naomi? Thomas nodded curtly. She called me, told me things I didn't want to believe. Said she had proof. I inhaled deeply, steadying myself. She's upset that Lucas moved on from her. She's trying to stir up trouble. And you're saying there's no truth to her claims? He pressed, his eyes locking onto mine. I met his gaze. None. For a brief moment, I thought he might believe me, but then he turned and left the room without another word, leaving me standing there, my heart racing. That night, Lucas came into my room, his face pale and his movements stiff with tension. What's going on? He asked, closing the door behind him. Thomas knows something, I said, my voice shaking. Naomi must have gotten to him before we could stop her. Lucas sat on the edge of the bed, his fists clenched. What do we do? I don't know, I admitted, my words barely audible. If he finds out the truth, he won't believe us. We won't let him, Lucas said firmly, though I could see the fear in his eyes mirroring my own. The next evening, Thomas insisted we have a family dinner. It was rare for him to make such a request, and the forced civility of it set my nerves on edge. The three of us sat at the table, the clinking of silverware against plates the only sound for long stretches. So, Lucas, Thomas said suddenly, breaking the silence, how's the job search going? Lucas looked up, startled. Fine, he said hesitantly. I've been looking at a few options. Thomas nodded, his face unreadable. Good. I was starting to wonder if you planned on staying here forever. The pointed comment made Lucas stiffen. It's not like I'm in your way, he said quietly. Thomas's eyes flicked to me, then back to Lucas. No, but I think it's time you moved on, don't you? I opened my mouth to intervene, but Thomas raised a hand, silencing me. I think we've all gotten a little too comfortable with this arrangement. It's not healthy. Lucas stood abruptly, his chair scraping against the floor. If you've got something to say, just say it. Thomas leaned back in his chair, his expression cold. Fine. I think it's time for some honesty from both of you. My heart pounded as his eyes locked onto mine. The room seemed to shrink around me, and I struggled to find the words to diffuse the tension. Before I could speak, Lucas stepped forward. There's nothing to say, he said firmly. Naomi's lying. She's trying to mess with us because I ended things with her. Thomas's eyes narrowed. And why would she drag Ava into her lies? She's desperate, Lucas said. She'd do anything to hurt me, and bringing Ava into it was the easiest way. Thomas's gaze didn't waver. And you expect me to believe that? Yes, Lucas replied, because it's the truth. The room fell silent. Then Thomas stood, his movements slow and deliberate. Maybe it is, he said finally, but I'm not convinced. Until I am, I think it's best if you find somewhere else to stay. Lucas turned to me, his eyes filled with an unspoken question. I wanted to tell him to stay, to fight this together, but I knew it would only make things worse. It's fine, Lucas said quietly. I'll go. The house felt emptier without him. Thomas seemed more at ease with Lucas gone, but his suspicion toward me hadn't completely vanished. I called Lucas every day, though our conversations were brief and strained. He had rented a small apartment across town and was trying to focus on work, but I could hear the frustration in his voice. I hate this, he said one night. Being away from you, letting her win. It's only temporary, I said, though I wasn't sure I believed it. The distance was wearing on both of us. Just when I thought things couldn't get worse, Naomi made her final move. One afternoon, while I was running errands, she showed up at Thomas's office. She didn't have proof, but she knew enough to plant seeds of doubt. When I got home, Thomas was waiting for me in the living room. Sit down, he said, his tone icy. I obeyed, my hands trembling in my lap. Naomi came to see me, he said, his voice cold. She told me everything, or at least enough to make me question what you've been telling me. Thomas, she's lying, I said quickly. Is she? He snapped. Because it feels like everyone's lying to me right now. The room was silent for what felt like an eternity. Then he stood and walked to the door. I'm leaving, he said. Don't bother calling me until you're ready to tell me the truth. Thomas didn't come home that night, or the one after. I tried calling him, but he didn't answer. The house felt unbearably quiet, and for the first time I wondered if I had lost everything. Lucas came over a few days later, his concern evident as he stepped through the door. Are you okay? He asked, pulling me into a tight hug. I don't know, I admitted, tears streaming down my face. I don't know. He stayed with me that night, and for a brief moment, it felt like everything might be okay. but deep down, I knew the damage was done. Our lives would never be the same.